continuing in Matthew in our lectionary text.
Red light.
You got to turn me down again. How does this happen? Last Sunday, we were in Matthew in just a preceding section. Do you remember what the context was?
Maybe? Find out. What's the matter?
Huh?
What's the matter?
Yeah, yes. Ooh. I'll give you your money after church.
Ask you.
We're talking about miracles.
What's that right here?
And who's the miracle we challenged out last week? Who were the miracle workers?
Where's she at? Oh, she's over there.
Who? Say it. What miracle were we celebrating?
Just so she.
And translated?
You know how to do it now?
I have to bring it in.
Come on.
We celebrated our
Yeah.
Right here.
Was that not our
Watch for that.
love thy
interpreted miracle here in our midst, right? Okay. It's good to review. I'm being in school. So this is another story of another miracle story that follows right afterwards. Book of Matthew and
So you get her in there.
14th chapter, verse 22.
Can you see her?
And Jesus is
You come by him.
walking on the water. Okay.
She moves around.
And it says, immediately, so this means right after this feeding of the multitude, the big crowd, 5,000 plus people, 5,000 plus the women and the children. So immediately after that, this is how the story is recorded in Matthew. Immediately after, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. The other side of what? Yeah, the Sea of Galilee. It's a big body of water. It's big. It's not as big as our Great Lakes. So put the disciples in a boat and told them to go on ahead of him to the other side, while Jesus then stayed to dismiss the crowd. Now, after Jesus had dismissed the crowd, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. It was later that night, and he was there alone. Now, the boat with the disciples in it was already a considerable distance from land, and it was buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. They were in a storm. Shortly before dawn, so the night has passed. Shortly before dawn now, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Can you imagine? Terrified. And the response was, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear of what they were seeing. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," replied Peter, "tell me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said, "Come." So then Peter got down out of the boat and he walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid
and he began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and he caught him up. And he said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Word of God for the people of God. There's so many interesting points to catch in this story. Why I read it particularly slow and animated, if you will. I mean, mainly we know this story just as walking on the water. That's what we catch the whole thing as. Just like the miracle of the feeding the 5,000. We don't look at many other aspects of the story to see where other messages come. We just celebrate the miracle part of it. And that's good stuff. But we're here to learn, right? And there's some other sides to pick apart that we can learn from in this. So besides just the fact that Jesus walked on the water and the storm in the middle of the night and scared the bejeebers out of his disciples. Well, come on, that's funny. Thank you. Just beside that, Peter took a few steps on the water too, but then started to sink as he doubted. I mean, there's some things to look at here. If we only see just that miracle part of it, we're missing some of the other parts of the story. Missing other details. So as I mentioned, this comes directly following that feeding of the 5,000 crowd of last week, the huge crowd, along the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is very large. I've been on there twice. And it's just sort of a hillside. Along the side, it's now shrined and has a chapel there and all kinds of extra adornment because it's a major tourist site. And then you look out over the water, and it's a big lake. It's hard to see the shore on the far side. It's a big lake. It has waves and some level of tides as we know them. And so onto that, this massive crowd of 5,000 some people had gathered. And if you remember the story about the feeding, it was late after a long day. Jesus had been preaching and teaching. All these people were there. You can imagine the demand. He'd been doing miracles of healing and other interactions with people. This long day. And we get to this point, and Jesus sends the disciples away. Tells them to get into a boat. We're not talking a yacht cabin cruiser. We're talking about a wooden kind of, primitive boat. Not a 16-foot Lund, mind you, but something a little bigger. And sends him out into the water. And he's left there to disperse a crowd, it says. To send those 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people on their way. So he sends them off, and you got to say, well, why would he do that? Wouldn't he leave himself alone to deal with his crowd? Have you thought about that? Got to wonder why he would send them off to a boat, and he told them to go out into the water, and it seemed their goal was on the other side, but they never really made it to the other side until the next day. They were out in this giant lake alone. Perhaps Jesus wanted them to have some quiet time to reflect together, sort of fellowship time, if you will. And sends them out in not pleasant circumstances, but unpleasant wind and waves. So a little precarious out there, uncertain, not sure where they were going, how it was going to play out, into the night, no electricity, remember? Probably a waggly old lantern. And they're out floating in the middle of this giant lake. with the wind and the waves. Jesus, meanwhile, is left on shore. He disperses the crowd by himself. And where does he then go afterwards? Huh? He goes off to be alone. The story says up a mountainside. You know, mountains are relative, not that he hiked a few hours necessarily someplace. He went up along a side someplace by himself. And he basically spent the night there. Praying, resting, talking to God. He must have been exhausted. He had spent the whole day pouring out of himself all day long, giving it out, giving it out, giving it out. People demanding of him healing, miracles, tending to all these people, demanding, wanting stuff from him, pouring out his spirit. He needed his downtime. Introverts, you know what I'm talking about? The night passes, it says. He spent the night there, alone on the mountainside. The disciples spent the night out in a boat, floundering in the middle of the lake. Floundering. Okay. My control side says, how come nobody got in charge and took the boat someplace and they landed? Did they not have oars? Surely they had oars. Why didn't somebody take charge and get them someplace? Well, their leader was on shore. Their leader was on shore. Jesus spends the night on the hillside, no doubt exhausted, needing some downtime to refuel. Disciples in their boat, they're out floundering in the bad weather, never landed, spent the night in the boat on the lake. An all-nighter. How would you be feeling? Pretty rough, right? Pretty rough. The text says just before dawn. Some translations say early next morning. Depends which one you're reading, but it was obviously in the start of the next day, someplace around dawn, someplace just as the sun starts to creep up over the horizon and a cast of light is begin to glow over the water, so you can see something beyond just sheer darkness. The next morning, it says, Jesus walked out to them. The weather was still rough. All part of the plan, it seems. The weather was still rough. Things had not smoothed down. We're not just talking about weather. We're talking about circumstances, rough places in our life, difficult spots on our journey. The weather was still rough. The disciples were floating without their leader out in the middle of the lake. It'd been a rough night, lost on the lake. They see a figure walking on the water. Rub their eyes, and no doubt going, what in the world are we looking at? And the response naturally would be, yeah, a ghost. You'd be terrified. You're like, what in the world are we seeing? Did you see that? Marlene, did you see that? I mean, what were we looking at? Terrified. It's a ghost! Ah! Screaming in fear. No doubt. No doubt. They didn't know what it was. And then Jesus speaks. I can imagine what those words would have felt like. Imagine the calming of that. And he says those simple words, take heart, it is I. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You ever had somebody tell you that when you're in a terrified situation? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. The answer to the disciples, fear and terror. The answer to their lostness out floating on the lake all night long and the storm bashing around them and not knowing what's going on. Their leader has been separated from them. They're just floating in their little wooden boat in the midst of a storm. If you flip this place over, it'd be like an ark. Never thought of that before. They were terrified. The story could have ended there. This is, I think, is sort of interesting. The story of the text could end right there, and you could preach that all by itself. You could teach it, you could reflect on it, you could learn right there that in the midst of the storm, Jesus responds and he says, I'm here, don't be afraid. It could end right there, right? But the rest of the story carries on. And it involves the example of one disciple in particular. One lone person in this conversation that we have. And it's Peter. Peter speaks up. And we don't know exactly how many were in the boat and who all was there. We don't get those details listed for us. But Peter speaks up. And I have to wonder when I read those words and think about Peter, what in the world was he thinking? What was his angle on it? What was his take? Why was he the only one? You know, was he just a sort of type A control person and responding? What was going on there? I think there's several ways we could wonder about Peter's words and how we might learn from that continuation of the story. And because on one level you look at Peter and you go, is he challenging Jesus? Is he sort of issuing a throwdown of sorts? Because it's like, if it's you, make me come and walk on the water. Do you have the power to do that? Let me see if I can do it. You hear that? We don't know how it's read. Was Peter sort of challenging? Was he testing him? Was he testing who Jesus was and Jesus' power and authority? I mean, walking on the water is pretty big. You ever seen anybody walk on water? Maybe he was doing it to seek out some favor, like that, you did it, I can do it, I'll try, I'm brave enough, sort of, risk recreation, right? Or maybe he was in a competition with the other disciples. Maybe he wanted to be first amongst them, so he wanted to, get the leg up and do it before the others got the idea and prove himself somehow with more faith and superior to the others. What was his motivation? I mean, he says, if it is you, he says to Jesus, if it's you, then command me to come and walk. Seeing Jesus for Peter wasn't enough. Just seeing him wasn't enough. Hearing him wasn't enough for him to believe. He was pushing it a little further. You hear that? Another point of view on Peter might be, maybe he was just testing his own faith. Maybe it comes out of a place of humility of himself. Did he have the courage to step out of the safety of the boat? Now there's a big question. Did he have the courage to step out of the safety of the boat? Remember, they'd been out there all night. They were tired. They're disorientated. The waves were still rolling. The winds were still saying they must have been hungry. Had to go to the bathroom for sure. Maybe that was his own test of where his faith was. Did he have the courage to step out of the boat? Was he captivated by that ghost and that exchange of words of that person coming across the water? Did he have the courage to step out of the boat in the safety of that environment, such as it was familiar territory? And was he brave enough to go and get out of that familiar place into something new because Jesus called? Step out in faith that he could walk too. Maybe that's where Peter was coming from. To step out on faith and just see if he could do it. Walk in the footsteps of Jesus. The text says that Peter got out of the boat. He took, we don't know how many steps he actually took, but he began to get afraid. He got out of the safety of his boat that he knew and starts to walk, and the wind and the waves scared him, and he began to sink. He started to lose that faith, that bravado, that challenge, whatever it was in him that got him out of the boat in the first place. And then when he started to get into a little bit of conflict, he started to lose his courage and he starts to go down. And what happened? What happened then? Did he sink? Did he go under? He asked for help. I want you to hear this example of Peter in this part of the story. He stepped out of his place of comfort, such as it was. But it was familiar to him. He knew it. He'd been in it all night. And he sees Jesus coming. He engages us. He got out of the boat. He wanted to do it at some level for whatever all his motivation was. He gets out there. It was a little scarier than he bargained for. A little more conflict. A little more challenge. And he starts to go down a little. And he cries out for help. And there comes the hand. Jesus immediately, it uses the word immediately, extends his hand and walks him back to the boat. And that whole scenario of the water walking comes to a close. Jesus reaches out a hand and leads him back to the boat. Peter was never alone. You need to know that. Peter was never alone in his fear, in his test, in whatever was going on up here and in here. I think perhaps Peter's strongest message to us was not in his words at all, as we have in the text of saying, Lord, if it's you, command me to come. It's not just in hearing Christ's command or invitation to any of us, because you all sitting here have heard the command and invitation of Jesus to follow him before, have you not? You all have heard that before. Come follow me. Take me into your heart. Make me your priority. Be a follower of me, of Jesus Christ. Model your life after me. That we've all heard those invitations and those commands, whichever word works best for you. We've all heard those invitations. We've heard it repetitively over and over. But what was different about Peter is that he didn't just hear the invitation, even when Jesus says, well, come on, I'll help you. But he actually stood up and got out of the boat. He got out of the boat. He didn't just hear and listen as good congregants on a Sunday morning. He didn't just hear the words. He got out of the boat, people. He stepped out into uncharted territory. Nobody had ever done that before. He got out of the boat into unfamiliar space. He met the challenges and the onslaught. It was wind and it was waves and it was terrifying, no doubt, even with Jesus right there with him. But he got out of the boat and he tried. He put his effort to work. He put his faith into action. He got out of the boat. It wasn't just about listening dutifully. He got out of the boat. He stood up into the rough and the uncertain waters. He did not just hear, but he took action. And there is the truth. There is the difference. To me, there is the lesson of this story. Not just walking on the water, but he got out of the boat. And he put out this new effort into these scary, unknown waters. Uncharted territory. My friends, being a disciple of Jesus Christ is a risky, it's exciting, but it is also uncertain business. Being a disciple of Jesus Christ is risky, it's exciting, but it's uncertain. And sometimes it is terrifying because it's vulnerable. But that's exactly how we fall deeper into Jesus' hands. We don't do it from places of comfort. And that is exactly what God calls us to do and to be. God assures us that if we will just get out of the boat, we can count on Jesus to be right there with us. Wherever your boat is, maybe it's aging, maybe it's assisted living, maybe it's your body doing changes on you, maybe it's sickness, maybe it's loved ones failing in health. Maybe it's uncertainty of your children, of your own future because of bad choices. Maybe it's your health. You just don't know where it's going. It's a new place that you're living, a new life you're trying to establish, new relationships. Maybe you're starting over because of loss. Maybe you're facing, who knows what that is. It's all your story. That is your scary boat. To step out and follow Jesus means you go with that, but you're not alone. That's what Peter did. That's the rest of the story. He got out of the boat, out of the safety and security that he knew, and he stepped out into the rough waters. Theologian and preacher William Willimon, one of our contemporaries, in one of his sermons said this way. If Peter had not ventured forth, if he had not responded to the call to walk on the water, then Peter would never have had this great opportunity for recognizing Jesus and for the rescue by Jesus. I wonder if too many of us are merely splashing about in the safe shallows and therefore have too few opportunities to test and to deepen our own faith. The story today implies that if you want to be close to Jesus, you have to venture forth out onto the sea. You have to prove his promises through trusting God and through risk and venture into the unknown. Getting out of the boat with Jesus in the most risky, most exciting, most fulfilling way to live life to the fullest. Each disciple, each follower, each of you is being invited, is being challenged, is being commanded to do just that, just like Peter. Responding not just to seeing and hearing, but with actions. Risking to walk beside Jesus. Amen.